In this final chapter, what we're looking at is monetary policy. So in the previous chapter with fiscal policy, we talked about how the government can, let's just call it, help an economy, for lack of a better term. And what we mean when we say that the government can help the economy, we mean that the recessions are shorter and that the expansion periods are longer. Now what we're talking about is with monetary policy. Now we're talking about how a central bank helps the economy. And the way that it primarily does this is by changing the money supply. It changes interest rates. Which changes consumption and changes investment. This is how I can get the economy out of a recessionary gap. Remember here it was I change G or I change T so that I can kind of change C, right? Like that was all the things that were going on here. And remember, the reason why we're doing this is because the aggregate demand curve, or AD curve, equals C plus I plus G plus NX. And I can have a short run supply curve for the economy as a whole. But look, here's the problem here, right? Is that here, the economy is in an equilibrium that's to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve. We need to do something to shift the AD curve to the right. We could do that with fiscal policy, with expansionary fiscal policy. What we're going to see here is that I can do that also with expansionary monetary policy. And that's kind of what we're going to look at here in this chapter. So interest rates are going to be of prime importance as we're talking about this because they are the things that then ultimately start to affect the consumption and starts to affect the investment. So let's look at first then what the interest rates are. Interest rates are the price that I'm paying to use money. Or, alternatively, it can be seen as the reward paid or the benefit to not spending money. Now we typically are talking about this as if there's only one interest rate, but in reality there are actually quite many. So it doesn't matter too much, especially for this course, which one you want to think about. Like if you just want to think about what your car loan's interest rate is, I mean, you could just keep it something as simple as that, and that won't affect our discussion. The discussion itself would remain the same. Now, the question then becomes, how are interest rates determined? This is a key point here. It is not the case. The central bank, at least in the United States, doesn't dictate what the interest rate will be. It doesn't say the interest rate is going to be 5%. Rather, what it does is it changes the money supply. And that's the key thing that that a central bank, in the case of the United States, the Federal Reserve, does. It changes the money supply to change the interest rate. And the way that that looks is that I put the interest rate here. It's going to be called R for interest rate. Quantity of money will be on my x-axis. The money demand is downward sloping. What we mean by money demand is we mean your demand to be holding cash or to need cash or something. If the interest rates are very high, you're not going to want to hold a lot of cash, right? Because you're going to want to put it in the bank and earn that very high interest. If interest rates are very low, as they are now, people might be willing to hold lots and lots of cash. The money supply is completely vertical. It's determined by the central bank and is not dependent on what the interest rate is. The central bank determines that this quantity of money will exist because they print it. Their intersection point is going to be the interest rate. Now there's lots of, as we said, there's lots of different kinds of interest rates. I don't even really want to spend too much time on this slide, if only because these slides were made in 2011 and interest rates are different from then, right? This is almost a full percentage less today than it was in 2011. Let's look at some other ones here. This is lower, almost negative. Yeah, I mean, money supply has expanded since 2011. I don't know what else to say. But, I mean, what you get from this is at least an idea of the different interest rates that exist, some of them, and what they are interest rates for. So it is kind of useful as a chart in that sense. And at least in the developed world, the idea that interest rates are low worldwide. Right? Japan, incredibly low. US, United Kingdom, Canada, all pursuing rather similar central bank monetary policies. So let's go a little bit into more detail about what the demand for money looks like then. Remember, what we drew here is quantity of money and the interest rate, or R. And that what we said is that the money demand, the demand for real money balances, is downward sloping. Two primary reasons for that. There's a transaction side to this and an asset side to this. On the transaction side to this, well, you're going to want to spend, if the economy is larger, you're going to need more money to spend. And you're going to see that bigger economy when there's more money that exists out there. And in that transactions demand for money here, we're not talking about this picture here. This picture is looking at that asset demand theory of money existing. But in the transaction side, we're simply just saying an economy that's bigger needs more money to exist than one that's smaller. Asset demand, the higher the interest rate, the more you're going to want to save it. Now we add the two up together. That gives us the money demand here. So this is kind of only part of it. This is only the asset side to it. We would add to it with the transaction side to this to get the total money demand. And that's exactly what we see here. All that they're doing here is they're just saying that given the fixed size of the economy, let's say that the economy requires $100 billion of money to exist, all it's going to do is shift this by 100. So that at interest rate infinity, basically, we are at 100, because that's our starting off point, or that the end point, the x-intercept on this side, would be 100 more than 200. So basically all we kind of did here was exactly shift this. I'm sorry, not vertical, horizontal. Horizontally shifted this by 100. Size of the economy requiring more money to exist. Interest rates determining how much money exists and how much money people hold. And this is adding them up together. Which then means that the interest rate itself, that equilibrium, is again then determined by, I shift the money supply to change the equilibrium interest rate. That the money demand itself, in some sense, is kind of constant, but what's shifting is the money supply, and as the money supply shifts, it changes the interest rate. If I have an economy that looks like this, and at least the policy of the past 9 years has been to increase the money supply, or what's called expansionary monetary policy. That what that does is it shifts my money supply curve causing my interest rate, equilibrium interest rate, to fall. Let's put this here for a second. Now, the question would be, how does a central bank like the Federal Reserve, or sometimes just called the Fed, how do they change the money supply? Well, the primary way that the Federal Reserve changes the money supply is with what's called an open market operation. That's the buying and selling of, I need to add a keyword here, I don't know why the textbook just neglected to include this. The buying and selling of existing government securities or government debt. Essentially, the central bank holds a very large amount of government bonds. And what it can do is it can buy and sell those bonds. Now, when the Fed buys a bond, it's buying a bond from like you or I or some private individual. But when it buys that bond, it pays for it with new money. Meaning, money is printed to pay for this bond. Which is another way of basically saying that the money supply is going up. Or that we have expansionary monetary policy. Now, alternatively, the Fed could sell a bond and if the Fed sells a bond, then it destroys the money that it is paid. Right? So I could buy a bond, I as an individual could buy a bond that's sold to me by the Fed. And if the Fed sells a bond, someone else will pay cash for it, that cash will be destroyed. That would mean that the money supply is going down That would be a contractionary monetary policy. So this is one of 3 ways that I can change the money supply with an open market operation. It can also be changed with the reserve ratio. And basically, banks are required to keep a certain amount of reserves. So when you and I make a deposit, we make a deposit, and let's say that a typical bank only is required to keep 10% of the total deposits. So if you deposit a check, a payroll check, a paycheck for $1,000, the bank's only going to keep $100 of it, and they're going to lend out the other $900 because that's how banks make money. Banks make money by lending money. Now, what if I change this to 5%? Well, now banks can lend out 95% of the money. That's going to mean that if I lower the reserve ratio, I am increasing the money supply. Right? Because now banks can lend out more money, and when banks lend out money, that means that more money exists. If the reserve ratio had been increased, that would have meant the money supply was falling. This would have been an expansionary monetary policy. This would have been a contractionary monetary policy. That's our second way then of changing the money supply. Not used as often. The first one is really used the most. The third one, the last one, is the discount rate. So the Fed, or the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, is what's called a lender of last resort. Basically, if you're a bank or some other financial entity and no one else will lend money to you, the Federal Reserve can, and oftentimes will. But remember, if the Federal Reserve is making you a loan, they're making you a loan with money that they're printing. So the discount rate is essentially the interest rate paid to borrow from the Fed, to borrow from the central bank. Well, if I lower the discount rate, that could at least theoretically mean that more banks would borrow from it. Which would essentially mean that I'm going to be increasing the money supply, because now the Fed's going to have to make more loans, increasing the money supply even more. If instead I had raised the discount rate, that would have meant that the money supply would have been falling. And you can see this as an example right here. This kind of discussion, at least, is that as I change the reserve ratio, right, in this case, let's say I go from 4 to 1, I lower the reserve ratio, I increase the money supply. Essentially what we're doing here, to get required reserves basically equal columns 1 times column 2. The actual reserves, they would have to tell you what those are, but Then if we take 3 minus 4, we get the excess reserves. That's what banks can lend out, the extra reserves of what they can lend out. So we're saying that if banks have $20,000 in checkable deposits, meaning in total deposits, and they only have a 10% required reserve ratio, they're only required to hold $2,000. But let's say the bank actually had $5,000. Well, they could lend out that extra $3,000. Now, how does it, here's the question, how does it go from 3 to 30? Because this $3,000 that now gets lent out, other banks start lending out that $3,000 that they're receiving, and so on and so forth, such that you get an equation that looks like this. 1 over the required reserve ratio. 1 over the required reserve ratio, or RRR, 1 over the required reserve ratio, 1 over 0.1 equals 10. That's called my money multiplier. And then I'm simply multiplying column 5, 3,000, times 10 to get 30,000. Again, the money multiplier is what happens when basically all the banks that start receiving, well, let's just look at the first bank. The first bank gets this $3,000, right? The bank lends it out, someone gets a loan check, they deposit it. That would mean some other bank down the line is going to have a $3,000 loan check. Well, that bank then is going to hold on to 10% of it, right? So they're going to hold on to $300, which means $2,700 can now be lent out to some other bank that then will just have to keep back $270, right? Which means that $2,430 can be now lent out, and so on and so forth, such that it's all going to add up to $30,000. I've said this already, but basically the first two of the open market operations are the most used. The reserve ratio does not change very much. It doesn't change very much because it's hard for banks to plan their operations if the Federal Reserve keeps saying you need to call in loans. Like, that's just a bad way to do business. The discount rate, it turns out that banks don't like to borrow from the Federal Reserve because the Federal Reserve starts to get really freaked out and has to ask a bank, hey, why do you keep borrowing from us? What's going on? Are you really running your operations well? So most banks would probably not want to borrow from the Federal Reserve if they didn't have to. And so then here's our summary, 2 slides here. Here's our expansionary policy, which essentially means, or why would you use it? You would use it because the economy is in a recessionary gap. Which means that you would use it because your short run equilibrium is to the left of your long run equilibrium. That's why you would use it. This is again called a recessionary gap. So what would they do? They would either buy securities, that's our open market operation, they would lower the reserve ratio, or they would lower the discount rate. Doing any or all of these things would allow my AD curve to shift to the right and fix the problem. Alternatively, we can have restrictive monetary policy, or sometimes called contractionary monetary policy, especially if you're using like the internet and whatnot to look up additional material, you'll see it much more oftentimes called a contractionary policy. You would use that when you have inflation, or what we would call an inflationary gap. And the way that that looks is that my short run equilibrium is to the right of where it should be in the long run. So then I'll either sell securities, that's again my open market operation. I'll increase the reserve ratio, increase the discount rate, all in an effort to lower my aggregate demand and fix the economy. And so that when we put that all together, what we see is that changing the money supply then changes the GDP levels and changes the price levels, right? We saw that. Right? By me changing the AD curve, I'm now changing the overall price level and I'm changing the overall real GDP levels. And that triggers other events, such as investments changing because the interest rates are changing. As investments then change, that changes aggregate demand, which changes real GDP and the prices. And you see that then played out here. That I can look at it as what my money demand looks like for various money supply points. Different money supply points, right? Each of these vertical lines representing a different amount of money supply, which gives me my investment demand curve, ID, which if I then apply it to the different investment levels, 15, 20, 25, my AD curve is going to the right the more investment exists. And that should make sense because AD equals C and I and G and NX. So what does that all look like? This is an important slide. This is slide 16. This is basically what's called another thing that it's called if you're looking this up on the internet, is a monetary transmission mechanism. It's a technical term for what's going on here. But essentially, if I know that I'm in a recessionary gap, meaning I have unemployment, I have lower GDP levels, then the Fed will do one of these three things, or all three of these things. That what that does is it causes banks to have excess reserves. Banks lend out those excess reserves. And what we see is that the money supply keeps increasing. And as the money supply is increasing and the interest rate is falling, that what happens is that we get more investment spending, we get more consumption spending, consumers buying more stuff. And we see the real GDP rising. Or, as I've drawn it out multiple times here, but why not write it out one more time? That what's happening is that here I'm in a recessionary gap. I'm doing these three things to get my AD curve to shift to the right. It's because the Fed is doing something that it's a monetary policy because the central bank is doing it. And the next slide is the reverse situation, also an important slide, slide 17. That the Fed could realize that inflation levels are too high, and that as it realizes that inflation levels are too high, it does one or all three of these things, sells the bonds or increases the reserve ratio or discount rate. What that means is that banks then have less money on hand. The money supply starts to fall. When they say federal funds rate here, federal funds rate, that's just so you're aware of this is the interest rate that banks charge each other when they borrow from each other. And all we're saying that is if banks have fewer reserves, they're not going to want to lend out money to other banks unless they get paid more for it. The key idea, though, is that the money supply starts to fall. And as the money supply is falling, the interest rate is rising, which means that there's less investment, less consumption, causing inflation rates to fall. Or as we've seen here, that it looks like this. And what I'm trying to do is decrease my aggregate demand. And overall, the way that economists interpret this is that economists in general prefer monetary policy. Now, partly because, it sounds a little bad here, but partly because more economists work for the central bank, myself included. My first job was with the Federal Reserve, so that's a bit of my bias here. But there is an advantage to monetary policy, is that it just works faster. And it's isolated from the politics of everything, which, even in a typical presidential election season can get messy, but just politics in general is messy. So wouldn't we just want, nerdy economists just determining these kinds of things? And they can do it much faster. And it's also a little bit more subtle, the monetary policy, meaning that it doesn't come like me saying, like, I'm trying to save American jobs, right? Or, using a lot of rhetoric that just isn't serving any useful purpose. So what does the Federal Reserve then do? Like, how do we know what they're doing? Well, what they do is the Fed doesn't determine an interest rate. Rather, what they do is they target what they'd like the federal funds rate to be. So the way that you see this is right here. That the Federal Reserve looks very closely at this, and if this is what they want the federal funds rate to be, right, then if the actual federal funds rate was right here, then they would say, oh my God, we have to expand the economy more to get the actual federal funds rate here. Right? Because if the actual is above what the target is, so let's say that this line is the target, if the actual is above the target, then I need some expansionary policy. Because by increasing the money supply, I lower the interest rates down to the target. But the Federal Reserve doesn't get to, so notice what I'm saying here is that the Federal Reserve doesn't get to determine what the federal funds rate is. Rather, they just say what they'd like it to be and then try to move the market to where they'd want it to be. But they don't get to determine it. Now, the Federal Reserve did do a lot for the American economy, especially in this past recession, which was so severe. They had to do innovative things. They had to do a lot of work to try to fix the economy. And they were relatively successful, that the economy, at least seen in terms of the GDP and seen in terms of even just the equity markets or the stock markets, the economy has basically largely healed itself. But here's the concern. The concern right now is that interest rates have been kept too low for too long. Why would you care about this? Why would we be concerned that they've kept interest rates, at a fraction of a percent for too long? Because it creates inflation. So the Federal Reserve is starting to get very concerned that inflation is going to start to pick up. Now, monetary policy also does have a few of the same problems that exist in fiscal policy, and that's that it also takes economists some time to find out that there is a recession. So there is a recognition lag. And then also you have these other issues that in terms of the cyclical asymmetry, that you can have some different responses to if there's a recession. The Federal Reserve might do much more than if there's an inflationary gap, that they do more for recessionary gaps, and so there's this asymmetry in their responses. And then finally we have a liquidity trap, and that liquidity trap largely means that monetary policy loses its effectiveness if the interest rates are already very low. And during the, I wish I could say that in this course we would have had enough time to talk about this in more detail. I did teach an entire course on this just last semester. So we could obviously have an entire course about it, but this is 120, so just keep that in mind that I'm just, in some sense, I'm glossing over this. But the Federal Reserve during the financial crisis did do a lot of things in terms of its lender of last resort responsibility. We don't really need to worry too much about what each of these are, but basically these were all markets where no one was willing to lend money, and the Federal Reserve had to intervene to make the markets work again in terms of people, some groups saving money and some groups needing to borrow money. And you see that here as well, that in the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve was forced to do other things, such as make the money market funds guarantee that they would be worth $1 for $1. They started to make interest payments on reserves. All these things were designed to not only expand the money supply because of the recessionary gap that occurred during the financial crisis, but also to create faith again in the marketplace itself.